good afternoon, or perhaps good evening, depending upon where you are watching this session. I am Nadia McConnell, co-founder and president of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation, and I welcome you to our discussion. You know, Winston Churchill was to have said that you can depend on America to do the right thing after trying everything else. As for Ukraine, have we in any way exhausted doing everything else and are now ready to do the right thing? Whether it be in our diplomacy, whether it's fighting the information warfare, military strategy, or economic policy. We have today 3 members of Friends of Ukraine Network that have been tracking the various developments in all aspects of Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine from the beginning of the war in 2014. Ambassador John Herbst. These people really don't need introductions, but I will give them a brief introduction. Ambassador John Herbst, head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, former ambassador to Ukraine, and chairman of the National Security Task Force for Friends of Ukraine Network. Anders Aslund is chairman of the International Council at the Center for Social and Economic Research and former Atlantic Council senior fellow and chair of the Friends of Ukraine Network Economic Task Force. Ambassador Dan Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, former ambassador to Poland, and the Wisner Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and perhaps the most knowledgeable person in our government regarding sanctions. So, John, before getting to our advertised discussion on sanctions, I want to ask you to address the big elephant in the room, no pun intended, the news of the last few days about American delays in providing weapons. Some weapons already in Poland, ready to cross the border into Ukraine. What do we know about this?
All right. This is a very important issue, and it speaks to whether Trump to achieve a peace in Ukraine. We know that weapons, as you say, that were in the pipeline to go to Ukraine, in fact, that were being loaded on pallets for shipment in Poland to Ukraine, were pulled off the pallets, and this became known on Monday. And by Tuesday, lots of people who care very much about American security interests in Europe were asking the administration what's going on. A statement was issued from the White House press office saying this was being done because we have to worry about the diminution of American stocks, and some of this stuff was going to be diverted to the Middle East. But my understanding is that the White House, when first asked about this, had no answers, and they asked for time in order to get the answers. And this suggests, as, for example, Senator Shaheen has said publicly, that the decision was not taken in the White House or by Trump, but the decision was driven at DOD, the Department of Defense, by Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary for Policy. And he put out a rather peculiar statement a little bit later justifying this, which had an element, for those of you who know Macbeth, of out damn spot. And as of today, and it's now Thursday, there is no definitive statement coming from the White House. And it is odd that Colby issued a statement, but not the Pentagon spokesman, although he subsequently made a statement. I think that was either late yesterday or today. Now, having said all this, Harry Truman was right when he said the buck stops here, meaning that the president is ultimately responsible for the policy of his administration. And at the moment, weapons to Ukraine are paused. And this is peculiar because last week Trump took some steps which suggest he understands the dangers of Putin's massive air bombardment of Ukraine, which has become even more massive over the past couple of weeks. Then he was sympathetic to Ukraine's plight, and he promised to see if we can get additional air defense equipment to Ukraine. So how is it that just 3 or 4 days after that, you have a decision apparently coming from the Pentagon that undermines that. And it's also important to note that last week at the Brussels summit, excuse me, not the Brussels summit, the NATO summit in The Hague, a communique was issued, meaning it had U.S. Support to the NATO members would increase their defense expenditures to 5% because of the Russian threat. Because of the Russian threat. Very important acknowledgement of a danger that's been staring us in the face for 11 years. And that some of that money could be used for sending aid to Ukraine. And again, you want to undermine everything that just happened in The Hague, stop it, U.S. military shipments to Ukraine. So this looks like something driven by people who are always, let's say, not well informed about American national security interest in Europe, rather naive about Kremlin intention, and rather naive about the damage that Moscow has and can continue to do to us, especially if we are passive in the face of that threat. But again, the buck lands up on the Oval Office desk. And if the pause in American aid to Ukraine continues, say, for another week or so, then this is on the White House, this is on the president. Right now, I don't think it is. I was interested about the fact that Trump decided to call Putin today when it was already clear there's going to be a Trump-Zelensky call tomorrow. My understanding is the Trump-Zelensky call came from at the request of the Ukrainians, but the Trump call to Putin came at the request of the president, our president. But of course, if President Trump was hoping Putin would offer some tidbit to suggest that maybe he's willing to stop this truly barbaric bombing campaign in Ukraine and negotiate seriously a durable peace that enables Ukraine to exist as an independent, sovereign, and economically viable state, which is President Trump's sworn objective. Well, President Trump was disappointed. As Trump's national security aide Ushakov said, Trump said, yes, we're willing to negotiate, but our goals remain firm. And while Putin has not said his goal is to have political control of Ukraine, everything he has done suggests that. And his own statements just a few days ago at the St. Petersburg Forum, where he said, I believe that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people, so we have a right to all of Ukraine. And oh, by the way, there's an old saying in Russia that Russia's borders extend as far as every Russian soldier's presence. So Trump is hearing from Putin he's not willing to compromise. So for all the reasons I've just explained, and I'll add to that President Trump does not want to be seen as a putz for Putin. This ill-advised step taken by the Pentagon will not be U.S. policy sometime within the next week or so. Now, I've been wrong before. I've also been right before. But again, the key is, if this is still our policy a week from today, then it's on Trump and not on Elbridge.
Well, I won't, there's so much to comment on, but I will note, perhaps, is it finally dawning on our administration? Because I think in a webinar we held last week, talking after the NATO summit, and I think General Breedlove talked about that he saw a study which indicated that every time President Trump makes an overture to Putin, the bombing increases.
Phil's a very smart guy, so I imagine what he said is well-founded. I haven't seen that data, however. We do know that the bombing of Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian hospitals, Ukrainian museums has gone up. I don't know. I've seen statistics saying 2 or 3 times more than it had been before President Trump took office. I'm not going to lay that at the feet of President Trump. I think that reflects that Russia has increased its ability to pound Ukraine from the air in this period because they've been working hard on it, partly with the very important support of Iran, right? And also, Putin is certainly frustrated by Russia's inability to make serious gains on the battlefield. Despite numerous Russian official statements, there are still Ukrainian forces on Russian sovereign territory, not Russian claimed territory. Despite the Russian claim, I don't know, was it 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, they were going to take the Ukrainian city of Sumy. The Ukrainians in the last several weeks have been pushing the Russians back from Sumy. Yes, the Russians have made some progress, tiny, tiny progress in Donetsk. So this is not all good news for Ukraine. But again, the Russians seem to be most capable of killing Ukrainian civilians. I contrast that with the unusual pinpoint Ukrainian ability to assassinate Russian war criminals, whether in Moscow, whether in occupied Ukraine, or throughout the length and breadth of the very large Russian Republic, Russian Federated Republic.
Yes. So Ukraine does have some cards to play. Dan, right after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, Friends of Ukraine Network came up with their very first set of recommendations to Congress and the administrations. And those were a list of sanctions that we felt, if applied immediately, could have had a significant deterrent to further Russian aggression. I think, Dan, you, along with John Anders, Ed Chow, David Kramer, Robert McConnell, and myself, were the authors of those recommendations. None of those suggested sanctions were applied immediately. And those that were eventually applied dribbled out piecemeal. Then and since, we have not had the strongest policy of implementing sanctions, which were to have had to deter Putin's growing aggression. In fact, we organized this discussion in light of recent decisions to lift some existing sanctions. In late June, the US government lifted sanctions related to the construction of Hungary's Parks 2 nuclear power plant, according to reports. And the project is led by the Russian state nuclear company, Rosatom, which is supplying the reactors, financing, and a significant portion of the project. And of course, Rosatom is also managing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So what gives, Dan? Where are we on the whole sanction regime?
First, you are unfortunately correct that the Trump administration essentially lifted a previously existing restriction directed against the Hungarian nuclear generation facility PAX 2. And this is unfortunate because you can argue whether or not the US should be dependent at this stage at all on Russian nuclear inputs. Unfortunately, we allowed ourselves to become so. But the Biden administration, when it was going out the door, it allowed for a general exemption for nuclear energy generating projects and for financial transactions related to Russian nuclear energy related projects, but did not extend that carve out to PAX 2. The Trump administration extended the general carve out, but dropped the exception for PAX 2. So they gave the Hungarians a sweetheart deal. And I can see no good reason for it. It's not as if Hungary has been a good member of the coalition to resist Russia's aggression. They've been consistently bad on Ukraine, and bad in that they come up with feigned excuses and complaints about Ukrainian policy, but they keep moving the goalposts when the Ukrainians try to address it. So that is unfortunate. But that's a relatively small issue. The larger issue is that we Americans are sitting on some perfectly good sanctions options, namely going after Russian oil sales. The Graham bill has a large menu, but its big club in the Graham bill is Section 17, which calls for 500% tariffs against the products of a country that imports Russian oil after the president makes a determination that Russia is not negotiating in good faith. Now, a 500% a threat of a 500% tariff is not a very good club, actually. We have trouble maintaining that against China or against India. It's not practical, okay? But the good news is the Senate, a lot of the senators involved in this bill understand that it's impractical and they're willing to change it. What would be practical is something closer to the Iran oil sanctions, which gave the administration a degree of flexibility, but proved effective in lowering Iran's income from oil sales. I won't go into the details, but it is a perfectly good option. It's available, and it would work. The other thing we could do is go after the rest of the Russian shadow fleet. The Biden people going out the door went after the Russian shadow fleet, but only part of it. They waited because the Biden people were worried that in an election year, it wasn't a bad idea to do anything that had the slightest risk of increasing crude oil prices, causing a spike in gasoline prices in the US. That was a mistake. It was a little bit too cautious, but at least going out the door after the elections, they did it. Now we ought to push further, especially now that Israel and Iran are no longer shooting at each other and the Iranians are unlikely to start to try to threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz. So for God's sakes, go after the Russian oil revenue. It is possible. Go after the ghost fleet, lower the oil price cap, threaten secondary sanctions. These are plausible policy options that we've got right now. Now, none of them is as important as assuring Ukraine of a steady flow of American weapons, which is why John's point at the beginning is so salient. And by the way, I agree with his analysis, so I won't repeat it. He's right. So there are two things that the Trump administration could do right now. Increase the sanctions by letting the Graham bill go forward, hopefully in a modified form to make its oil sanction provision more practical, and overrule the Pentagon's ill-considered and ill-prepared initiative to curtail necessary arms to Ukraine. Moreover, President Trump could then say that he intends to send additional patriots to Ukraine and that the United States wants to be able to sell arms to Ukraine, helping it defend itself and make money for U.S. industry and U.S. workers. Perfectly good options. Why aren't we using them? I suspect that there are some close to Trump, maybe Steve Witkoff, who are under the illusion that if you're nice to the Russians and offer them carrots, it will entice them to be constructive players. Ask John Kerry how running after Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov in 2016 about Syria worked out. Or ask any number of American presidents and secretaries of state, Republicans and Democrats, who found that chasing after the Russians doesn't work. I believe in talking to the Russians, not yelling at them, but talk to them on the basis of lowering the boom, hammering them, and then having a polite and constructive conversation the moment that they're ready for one. But if the Russians are maintaining a maximalist position, don't haggle with them, don't waste your time. And what frustrates me is that Trump could succeed in Ukraine, but he needs to put the pressure on the Russians, help the Ukrainians, and stop playing the Russian game of offering them concessions and promises of great economic cooperation in the days ahead. Just, knock it off. Don't be a fool. Go after the Russians, make them hurt, and then deal with them in a professional way. You don't have to make big speeches or pound the table, but hit them. Let that open the conversation.
Glad you told us what you really think, or will you tell us what you really think? Before talking more about the sanctions bill that has been brought up, I want to ask Anders. President Trump and some members of the administration and some so-called experts cannot seem to accept that Ukraine does, in fact, have cards to play. As has been mentioned, even in the face of Ukraine's spectacular innovation in weapons and tactics and their very unexpected successes on the battlefield, these and developments within Russia itself certainly have proven that with the right amount of assistance, Ukraine can and will win. Can you take us through a little bit about what you see from inside Russia that makes this not only possible, but probable?
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thanks for the invitation to this seminar. But let me start with, I'll come back to your question, but let me start with a brief overview. Trump pursues a hostile policy on Ukraine, and he has done so quite consistently with just minor aberrations. And this is with regard to diplomacy, no financial aid, now no arms, and no new sanctions on Russia since he became president. This is not by chance. This is by a choice. So I don't think that we should focus too much on one person or the other, because they are all appointed by Trump, because they have such views. But if we take diplomacy, because it's so obvious, Trump has talked, as far as we know, 6 times with long phone calls with Putin. He celebrated his birthday with a 50-minute phone call with Putin. He clearly loves Putin, and he clearly hates Zelensky, who's doing everything he can in order to mitigate Trump's aggression. And we saw this disgusting ambush by Zelensky, by Trump and Vance on the 28th of February. This was a provocation set up by them. And Trump stated one lie after the other, and Zelensky tried to very softly mitigate something, and then Trump got furious. Trump has never talked about any financial aid for Ukraine. Cutting off USAID meant that a lot of the money instantly disappeared for Ukraine. And with regard to sanctions, we are now seeing, as Dan so elegantly elaborated, how they are touching one thing after the other. Now PAX 2, the nuclear power station in Hungary, was accepted. We're also seeing the former president of Kalmykia, who was sanctioned because of the Syria sanctions. He escapes there. So what we are seeing is that the sanction regime is being undermined. I don't think these are accidents. These are intentions to see how much that can be done. And then we have a question that both John and Dan discussed. How can Trump's anti-Ukrainian policy be impeded? And then, of course, they're right. There is a big majority in the US and in the Congress in support of Ukraine. And Trump does not agree with it. And this Senate draft law that Lindsey Graham had championed has more than 80 senators behind it. But this will never be adopted. It has been there since the 1st of April. Good April 1st joke. And it will not go through. And this is just a diversionary maneuver by Trump to say that, yes, I'm thinking of doing something about Russia, but it's not true. We should simply see that this is what Trump absolutely doesn't want. There is so much in the Mueller investigation and in the two excellent books by Unger on the house of Trump and the house of Putin, about Trump's very extensive and long-time connections with the former Soviet Union. His main business idea was to sell condos in New York and Miami, no questions asked, to high-paying people who were not necessarily the people you would like to have in a New York cooperative as your neighbors. So Trump clearly roots for Russia's victory in Ukraine. And the question is how we can stop it. And I think that we have two major possibilities there. The main thing is to activate the Republican congressmen, in particular the senators, and also the military-industrial complex. They will not be happy if U.S. military supplies are becoming completely unreliable. In 2023, U.S. arms exports were $118 billion. So this is big money for the U.S., and it would increase now because of the general armament in the world, very much because of Russia's aggression. And the U.S. arms companies would not like to be outside. But back to your question, Nadia. So Ukraine spends about $100 billion a year on its defense. Russia spends about $170 billion. So Ukraine is not that far behind. And I'm sure that with more than 500 excellent startups, Ukraine has better technology than Russia and does it much more economically. When I last talked with Alexander Kamyshin, the former Minister of Strategic Industries in the Ukraine, he said that last year we produced arms for $10 billion. This year we can produce arms for $30 billion. So Ukraine can produce much of its arms itself, and it's really doing the most innovative arms, while Russian arms industry is dominated by this extremely corrupt Rostec, a big state corporation run by one of Putin's KGB friends from Dresden, Sergei Chemezov. And what I argue is that the West should make sure that Ukraine gets $50 or $100 billion more as soon as possible, and then Ukraine can win. Ukraine has the capacity to produce arms, and what it needs is money. It has probably 900,000 men and women under arms. Russia has 650,000 troops in Ukraine. So this talk about a lack of manpower is not true. It's just an idea that one should pursue a war as in World War I. And we know how well that succeeded. So this is not a very good idea. You should pursue a smart war. In the beginning of the war, the soldiers were 150 meters away from each other in trenches. Now they are 15 kilometers away from each other, hiding from the drones. So this war has completely changed in nature, and it's very much to Ukraine's advantage, even if the Russians are doing some very smart things also technologically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anders. John, I want to go back to, well, first, I want to comment on what you reported at the very beginning. Some of us who've been in Washington following Ukraine issues for, 40 years. One of the things, the big changes, which is really a challenge for us readjusting and of how we work in Washington, is that forever the DoD was always a very strong supporter of things that were, I would say, Ukraine related. In fact, we kind of use DOD to balance out at times the State Department's policies. But here we see the complete reverse, right? Where we're seeing some of the most challenging problems coming from DOD. Now, we mentioned the sanctions bill and the big bipartisan support. The Senate sanctions bill now has 84 co-sponsors, if I understand it correct. Now, it was introduced on April the 1st, but nothing has happened since then. It hasn't even gotten any committee action. There was a Washington Post, I guess, editorial that said, and this has been brought up by, I guess, Dan and others, that the closer you look at the fine print, the more the well-intentioned legislation starts to look like an unworkable mess. Is this going to be, as Anders said, end up being an April Fool's joke, or can we look forward to the Congress acting as a separate branch of our government?
Okay, thank you for a very good question. First, it's good that the audience hears different takes on what the Trump administration may or may not be up to. Andrew's view is really, I'd say, the majority view in the analytical community that Team Trump is prepared to hand over Ukraine to Putin. And Dan and I have a somewhat different view of that, as I've already outlined. And the whole question of the Lindsey Graham, Dick Blumenthal sanctions bill, is part of this conversation. My understanding, I don't know, for 6 weeks has been, even a little bit more than that, the White House was happy to see the bill in motion, but only in motion without actually being in a position to pass it, because they wanted the possibility of this bill as a lever on the Kremlin to be reasonable in negotiations with Ukraine. But as I made clear in my first intervention, Putin remains completely unreasonable. And Trump even seemed to acknowledge that last week when he said for the third time that he didn't need Putin's help on Iran, which Putin offered. He needed Putin's help on Putin, so he would stop obstructing peace in Ukraine. Yet despite that, as Anders points out, this bill has not moved. It has not moved because the White House still doesn't want it to move. And there's no question that there seems to be a tactical understanding in the White House, which is quite wrong, that the way to get Putin to make peace with Ukraine, a reasonable peace, is to throw flowers his way, as opposed to pressure him the way Trump pressed Zelensky after the infamous Oval Office meeting. And anyone who knows the Kremlin knows that's flat out wrong. Flat out wrong. So that this gives grist for Anders' mill that yes, Trump's view is he's willing to hand over Ukraine. Having said that, it would be harder for that to be the policy, whether or not it is Trump's interest in accommodating Putin at Ukraine's expense, if Republicans in Congress were to speak out strongly against. But as you know, Nadia, and as Anders and Dan know too, we had a somewhat similar situation in the Biden administration when Biden's reluctance to send Ukraine the more advanced weapons was frustrating for many very sound Democratic politicians. But those politicians were unwilling in public to challenge their president, just as the Republican politicians have been unwilling to challenge Trump. Interestingly, and hopefully importantly, but I say hopefully, it's not clear, we've seen a fair amount of unhappiness expressed publicly about this delay in this pause in weapons to Ukraine this week. Joe Wilson's been very strong. Brian Fitzpatrick has been very strong. Mitch McConnell, as always, has been very strong. And that, in theory, could tip things in the right way. But I say in theory, we'll have to wait and see if it happens in practice. And again, looking at this through political eyes, I would argue that it's more likely we'll see the right steps by the White House on the weapons question than on the sanctions question, because the problem created by that directive from the Pentagon is getting a lot of very, very unpleasant for the White House attention. And they can easily step away by just reversing that decision. They don't have to say a word, just let it happen. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see. And again, how that plays out will have direct bearing on whether Andrew's view or the view I've articulated turns out to be the right one.
Again, those of us that have been watching the Washington game of politics for a long time, I have been, look, we know that when you have a party controlling the Congress and the president is of the same party, that Congress is reluctant to challenge their president. And we see that, but it's done more subtly. I mean, was astounded when Senator Lindsley, I guess I didn't see the quote, on a weekend said, well, Trump is now ready for them to pass the bill. I mean, it seemed, again, I was astounded that they are relinquishing their leadership role so overtly.
Well, look, I mean, you've been watching the political scene here at least as long as I have, Nadia, and you know that what we've witnessed over time is growing power of the president. And this reflects not just foreign policy, but also domestic policy, and a kind of willingness of the Congress, the presidentially aligned party in the Congress, to go along with their chief executive. And we've seen Congress being unable to pass bills, which has led to abuse of executive orders by presidents of both parties. This is a fact which goes well beyond the specific, very important issue we're discussing here today. Just the way it is. But actually, there's one other thing I needed to add to your question, because you focused on the Pentagon in this case, and that's what we're talking about. But it's noteworthy that the political leadership at the Pentagon doesn't have the same view of the generals and the admirals. I mean, the new incoming SACEUR, right, 4-star for Europe, has said Ukraine can win this war. Now, he's absolutely right, but you've heard nothing similar from Secretary Hegseth or Undersecretary Colby. It's one of the blessings of American history that civilians control the Pentagon, but in this instance, I'm not sure it's the best arrangement for the country. It is, I mean, obviously we still want civilian control, but there seems to be greater wisdom from the Joint Staff than from the civilian leaders.
Hard to fathom. I mean, it's hard to sort of get your brain around some of the things that we're seeing here in Washington.
Yes.
Dan, I want to go back to issue of sanctions, but particularly we at the foundation have been, one of our major focus has been the whole issue of war crimes, whether it's the abducted children, sexual violence, or the mistreatment of prisoners of war. There's a resolution, I guess there is a resolution in the Senate and one introduced in the House, and I won't necessarily go into that, but I will underscore that they're resolutions, right, which do not have the force of law. But I want to go to the sanctions issue. We're happy to see the fact that more and more people are saying that you can't have a peace agreement without the return of abducted children. The possibility of that, I think, will leave for another discussion. However, there are things we have limited control over about getting the children back released to Ukraine, but we do have control over sanctioning. We've just finished an analysis that we looked at the sanctions that Ukraine has identified for those that are implementing this policy of abducting children. And it has sanctioned 236 individuals and about 63 entities. Now, we've also done an analysis of other countries. The US has sanctioned 63 of those individuals and only 6 entities. And I can go down the list. Canada 74, EU 77, UK 46, Switzerland 74, Australia, etc. Japan 27. So why are we not seeing more of an effort on applying sanctions to something that everybody, there's no disagreement that these are war crimes, and we have ability to do this? Why are we not seeing this? Why are there not bills on this issue, but only resolutions? If you could answer that.
Well, the Trump administration has been slow in increasing sanctions on Russia generally. Now, if I were in my old job as sanctions coordinator, I would probably press for us to go after the Russian economy and to concentrate sanctions on that. But I would also ask the human rights people at state to go after those responsible for abduction of children and compile the names, and it's not hard to do. You go talk to the Ukrainians, ask them to provide the information, and then have the sanctions people go analyze it. I'm afraid the answer is the Trump administration just sees the war differently. They're looking for a deal. They are looking to entice Russia to enter into a deal. And Secretary Rubio said something that Senator Rubio would have soundly trashed. He said additional sanctions against Russia will drive them away from negotiations. I think that is the kind of fatuous lack of realism that Republicans used to make a meal of. I remember when they used to accuse particularly left-wing Democrats of being gaga about Russia. Well, our administration should toughen up. So I think human rights-based sanctions against the Russians should be steady. We should be identifying people. All that means is that they won't be able to get away with it in the future, because once you're on a sanctions list, if it's US and Europe and UK, you can't travel. And for Russians, that actually means something. Not letting us travel to Russia is okay. I can live with that. But not letting Russians travel to Europe hurts. So I think we should do it. I think we should be doing it. And I think the Trump administration is simply wrong not to be pursuing it. But I'll finish, though, with what I started. My priority in sanctions would be to go after the Russian economy, because that puts pressure on them to end the war on Ukraine on sustainable terms.
Anders, you, of course, write about developments in Ukraine's economy and Russia's economy. I suspect you agree with Dan about the power of going after Russia's economy. If you want to talk about that, but also it seems like on the one hand, we are sanctioning people, then on the other hand, continue to buy Russian, oil and energy. We talk about frozen assets, but we're not willing to use them. right? We want to just use the interest or whatever. It's like we're shooting ourselves, well, not even in the foot, maybe in the head, about the balance between how much assistance we give and then how much we still continue to feed Putin's war machine.
Thank you, Nadia. Very good question. So let me start with this. There are $200 billion of the frozen central bank of Russia reserves, cash sitting in the Euroclear bank in Brussels. This money should be taken and given to Ukraine, and then we have full financing. Thanks to returns on these this money. Altogether, it's about $300 billion, considering what is in other places and not only in the European Union. The G7, June last year, promised Ukraine $50 billion, and this money has been mobilized. The US provided $20 billion. This was done by Biden in December. So he managed to transfer the money to a trust fund at the World Bank so that Trump could not stop that money. This is the US money that is now going to Ukraine. So Ukraine is fully financed this year of $100 billion, but all the money should be taken, and then Ukraine could have enough money to win the war. There was a question in the chat also about this, rightly so. Dan said many good things about sanctions, and I would like to add 2 points there. Dan and I work together in this international working group on sanctions that Andrei Yermak and Mike McFall have led, which I think has been really outstanding, with very good support from the Kiev School of Economics. And one of our principles there was, touching upon what you said, Nadia, is that all countries should have the same sanction, because there's no order whatsoever. So now what we are seeing all the time is that somebody sanctioned in one country, but lives happily in another Western country. There must be some coordination, and unfortunately, we don't see any move on that. And the other point I wanted to make is in the summer of 2017, the Congress adopted CAATSA, the Combating American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And it was 98 senators who voted for it. The only two who were against were Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders. And this CAATSA has turned out to be very useful, as Dan has pointed out in other contexts, because if you are sanctioned according to them with an executive order, you cannot escape it easily. It has to go through the Congress. And this is a very important trick that the Biden administration used, particularly towards the end, to make sure that the Trump administration should not be able to do away with the sanctions on Russia too easily. But finally, Dan, are there any human rights people left at the State Department? Weren't all of them laid off this last week?
I have not seen a list of the State Department firings, but to answer your question seriously, the Trump administration, well, the State Department's human rights people appointed by Trump seem to be preoccupied with complaints about West European practices with respect to rights to protest outside abortion clinics, and the European Union Digital Services Act, which tries to go after foreign malign influence, aka disinformation. which seems an interesting and odd set of priorities, given that their writ includes Tibet, Uyghurs, Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and countries that are truly repressive. So I don't know where we will end up at the end of whatever it is the Trump administration is doing with human rights, but their priorities seem to me questionable.
Well, again, we have three branches of government, and I think the Congress has a role to play. And I want to thank Carlos, is it Kuskiewicz, because I misspoke. Last session of Congress, there were only resolutions regarding abducted children. Now we have a bill that has been introduced by Senator Grassley and Senator Klobuchar. So we've made, there's progress there. And so I stand corrected. There's a question about Trump and Putin are engaged in talks about Iran and doing projects together. What can be done to raise objections?
I've seen some readouts of the conversation today between Trump and Putin, and apparently there was some general talk about U.S.-Russian economic cooperation. I wouldn't be surprised if Putin raised Iran and offered to be helpful. I'm not sure we need or want their help at this point, but in any event, the implicit ask from Putin for anything he offered on Iran would be that we be helpful to the Russians on Ukraine, which is a deal no American president should take. Full stop.
Thank you. Well, I think we're almost running out of time for our session. However, so I would like to just do closing remarks from our panelists. See if there are things that they would like to cover that hasn't been brought up yet. Let's start as we have with John.
Andrews got into somewhat the issue of the frozen Russian assets. This remains a critically important question. In the period after the election last November and the inauguration, Scott Bessent had said some things suggesting he saw movement on the assets as something that might be a good thing, but we've seen no such movement. So this is one more issue where, in theory, Congress could encourage the Republicans in Congress, like French Hill, who's very interested in the issue and sound on it, could encourage the administration to move on it. I think this is something that deserves more attention.
Dan?
I remain in favor of taking all of the Russian immobilized assets and using them for Ukraine. That said, the Biden administration did work with the Europeans on an arrangement to use those assets or the proceeds from those assets to back a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. So it's not as if that money is lying unused altogether. I'd like to do more, but at least the Biden administration and the Europeans have done something with that. More broadly, I am concerned that months go by and Trump neither pushes his ceasefire nor acts otherwise to increase the pressure on Putin. And he has set himself up for a potential win, but he has to land that deal. He has to deliver. And he has not done so yet. I hope he will. And as John, to paraphrase John, I hope that Trump shows that he actually has some plan other than capitulation.
Anders?
Yeah, I completely agree with John and Dan. The most important thing now is to seize the frozen assets. And the US has legislation for this matter that was adopted. And the US should lead on this issue, then it will be much easier for Europe to go ahead. In Europe, it very much depends on the new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, if he can gets the political strength to push ahead. Otherwise, it's not likely to happen. Germany is key, followed by France. But Britain could also do it. So there are several countries that could and should act. I should say just a couple of things about the economies. Both Russia and Ukraine are now very war-tired. So both countries are in inflation with double-digit inflation, and now very little growth, about 1.5% in both countries, it looks like, for this year. And this is not a very acceptable situation. Russia will likely have to cut its military expenditure for next year because it is running out of its reserves. So the financial sanctions are working, and therefore it's vital to maintain them. And of course, as Dan discussed, the oil sanctions should be strengthened so that Russia earns less money. But this works, but it works slowly, and Ukraine needs more money. This year it will get $100 billion again in Western financing, but for next year it is very unclear, and I can see no hope whatsoever that the US will contribute. Much of Europe is all the more mobilized, but these are substantial amounts of money that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you all. I just, there's a comment that's come in about the fact that the administration has cut funds to organizations like Yale that have been collecting and researching the whole issue of abduction of children. I want to announce that we will be reconstituting our Human Rights Task Force really to focus on seeking justice for victims of Putin's war crimes, and going to be co-chaired by Carl Gershman, which you all know, and then also Irvin Coulter, who's former Minister of Justice of Canada. And we will, in 2 weeks, we'll have a discussion about the tribunal that has just been organized. And also we will be focusing on the sanctions issue and other things. So we will hopefully can help put more of a light on these issues. Again, thank you so very much for joining us, taking time of your busy schedules, and till next time. До побачення.
Thank
Слава
you.
Україні. Bye.
Героям слава.